ever catch yourself just, like, staring off into space and wondering, what's the point of any of this?
Whoa,
Well, get ready,
getting there.
because today we're diving headfirst into that very question
Okay.
with a deep dive on nihilism.
All right.
But before you hit play on that gloomy playlist, I gotta tell you,
Yeah.
Aperture's take on this whole thing, it's way more nuanced and, dare I say, even kind of hopeful than you might think.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, nihilism, it gets kind of a bad rap, right?
Right.
People just like instantly think it's all doom and gloom.
Right.
But the fascinating thing here is that it's not actually about saying life has zero meaning, end of story. It's more about acknowledging that the universe,
Okay.
it doesn't hand us like a pre-written script or something
Hmm.
with our purpose all neatly laid out, like,
Yeah.
here's your meaning, go forth.
Right.
It's more like we're the authors of our own meaning.
Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit.
Yeah.
Aperture kind of kicks things off by diving right into that classic existential crisis.
Okay. We're born, we're here for a bit, we live our lives, and then we die.
Yeah.
And somewhere in the middle of all of that big looming why question just kind of rears its head.
Right, and that feeling, that existential sort of unease.
Yeah.
It's like prime real estate for nihilistic thought to take root.
Mm.
I mean, think about it. Religion, relationships,
Yeah.
even just the simple act of being alive, they're often presented as ways to find meaning, right?
Yeah.
But nihilism comes in and says, hold on a second, what if there isn't some kind of inherent, preordained purpose? It's a pretty radical notion when you actually let it sink in.
It is.
And honestly, it can be both incredibly liberating and, yeah, a little bit terrifying.
Yeah, it's like realizing the ground under you is maybe not as solid as you always thought it was.
Yeah.
And speaking of shaking things up a bit,
Okay.
Aperture, they don't shy away from the big, kind of scary questions.
Right.
They even go so far as to challenge this whole concept of good versus bad.
So, like, if there's no inherent meaning baked into the universe,
Yeah.
does that also mean that those concepts of good and bad are kind of just arbitrary?
That's where I think Aperture's analysis gets really interesting.
Okay.
They're not saying good and bad don't exist,
Right.
but they're pushing us to examine where those ideas even come from. Like, if there isn't some kind of universal rule book,
Right.
then maybe concepts like right and wrong, they're more like human constructs.
Right.
Not these absolute truths that are just like etched into the fabric of existence.
So it's not about saying anything goes. It's more like saying, hey, maybe we should take a closer look at where our moral codes come from.
Exactly.
And see if they're actually working for us.
Exactly. And this is where understanding the historical context that Aperture brings in is so crucial for really grasping all the nuances here.
Okay.
Because nihilism, it's not some monolithic entity,
Right.
There are actually different branches, different flavors of it, you could say.
Oh, so it's like different varieties of existential angst.
Something like that.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about these different flavors.
Well, there's political nihilism, for example.
Okay.
And that one really goes after the legitimacy of power structures.
Yeah.
Like governments, institutions.
Right.
It basically sees them as inherently meaningless and might even advocate for, like, dismantling them completely so we can start fresh.
So that's one branch. What else is there?
All right, so then there's ethical nihilism,
Okay.
which takes aim at those absolute moral codes,
Okay.
all those thou shalts and thou shalt nots that so many societies are built upon.
Right, right.
That branch really prioritizes individual freedom and challenges those, like, predetermined rules,
Yeah.
It's more about us each creating our own ethical framework.
So less about anarchy in the streets and more about just really making conscious choices about how we each define our own moral compass.
You got it. And finally, there's the one that probably pops into most people's minds when they hear the word nihilism, which is existential nihilism.
Okay.
And that's essentially what we've been unpacking so far. The whole idea that life itself inherently lacks meaning.
Right.
And that we're kind of tasked with creating our own.
And to add even another layer to this already pretty thought-provoking conversation, Aperture brings Friedrich Nietzsche into the mix.
Right.
And from what I understand, he had kind of a complicated relationship with nihilism. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Nietzsche, he really wrestled with both the potential for, like, destruction that nihilism holds, but then also the possibility for incredible liberation.
Okay.
Here's a key thing he argued.
Yeah.
He believed that actually confronting that seeming nothingness,
Yeah.
that lack of inherent order, it could actually push us to create our own values.
Hmm.
And that, in turn, could lead to a more authentic, self-determined existence.
Oh, I see. So instead of just inheriting a prepackaged set of values from our culture or whatever, we actually get to build our own from the ground up.
You got it. But, Nietzsche wasn't naive to the potential downsides either.
Right.
He also warned about nihilism becoming this kind of descent into pure chaos, a rejection of all values.
Yeah.
Which could, leave society in ruins.
Hmm.
It's a tricky balance to strike.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like walking into a completely empty house. On the one hand, yeah, it's a blank slate. You can do whatever you want with it.
Right.
But then again, you're the one who has to decide where to put the walls
Right.
and how to actually make it feel like a home.
Exactly. That's a great analogy because it really highlights both the incredible potential and the very real challenge that nihilism presents.
It can feel really exciting
Yeah.
and also a little bit terrifying at the same time.
Absolutely. Because on the one hand, it can feel like you're tearing down everything you thought you knew, which, let's face it, can be really unsettling.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, just like you said, it also opens up this amazing opportunity to rebuild, to create something totally new and meaningful, literally from the ground up.
And maybe, just maybe, it's through that process of tearing down and then rebuilding that we actually figure out who we really are.
Right.
And what we truly value, which, when you think about it, is a pretty amazing thing.
It is, yeah. And that's where things get really interesting because Aperture doesn't just leave us hanging with these big abstract concepts.
Right.
They actually dive into some of the practical implications of incorporating this kind of thinking into our lives.
Okay, so how do we actually apply this to our everyday lives? We've been talking around this philosophical black hole.
Right, yeah.
But what does nihilism actually look like in action?
That's the key question.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the most important things to remember is that nihilism isn't about just passively accepting that nothing matters.
Right.
It's about recognizing that in a world that might not have inherent meaning already built in, we have the power to create it.
So instead of being given a story that's already written, we become the authors of our own lives.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that can manifest in so many different ways, right? Through our relationships, our work, our passions, our art. It's about finding what truly resonates with us.
Yeah.
And building a life that reflects those values, even if those values are ones that we define for ourselves.
It's like that moment you realize the coloring book, it's actually totally blank. You get to pick the colors, draw the lines, the whole shebang.
I like that.
It's exciting, right?
Definitely.
But also maybe a little overwhelming.
Totally. And, Aperture, they don't shy away from that feeling of being kind of thrown into the deep end.
Mm-hmm.
They actually connect this back to the whole morality thing we were talking about earlier.
Right. Because if there aren't those cosmic rules about good and bad, does that just mean everything's fair game?
It's a question that's been driving philosophers a little crazy for centuries, honestly.
Yeah, it's one of those things that just pops into your head when you really start to question the foundations of everything you thought you knew.
For sure.
So how does Aperture handle this moral free-for-all thing?
So they make this really interesting point, which is that while nihilism might reject the idea of some kind of absolute moral code, like a rule book handed down from on high,
right,
it doesn't necessarily have to lead to this world where anything goes and there are zero consequences.
Yeah.
We still have to actually live with the results of our choices, even if there isn't some kind of divine scorekeeper up in the sky.
It's like that saying, freedom comes with responsibility.
Exactly.
Even if no one ever handed me a rule book that said stealing is bad,
right,
I still have to deal with the fallout of what happens when I steal something.
100%. And this is actually where Aperture suggests that nihilism can lead to a more thoughtful, more conscious approach to ethics.
Wait, hold on a second. Explain that to me.
Okay.
Because how does questioning everything lead to living a more ethical life?
I know it seems kind of counterintuitive at first, right?
It does.
But think of it this way. If you're not just blindly following a set of rules that somebody handed you,
right,
you're forced to really consider the why behind your actions a lot more deeply. Why is stealing wrong?
Yeah.
What kind of impact does that action actually have on other people, on me, on the world?
Mm-hmm.
You're essentially defining your moral compass for yourself.
Right.
And that can actually be a much more authentic and fulfilling way to live ethically.
Yeah, it makes sense. It's less about I'm following these rules because I'm afraid of punishment.
Right.
And more about I'm making these choices because I actually understand why they matter.
Yeah, exactly. It's about asking yourself, okay, what do I stand for?
Yeah.
Not just what can I get away with?
That's a great way to put it. There's still a part of me, though, that wonders about the flip side of that.
Okay, yeah.
Like, couldn't someone pretty easily twist this whole there's no inherent meaning thing
Yeah.
and use it to justify just being totally selfish?
Oh, for sure.
Like, if nothing really matters at the end of the day, why not just look out for number one all the time?
It's a super valid concern. And to be honest, it's a critique that gets leveled at nihilism a lot.
Right.
And Aperture, to their credit, they don't shy away from that at all.
Yeah.
They fully acknowledge that any philosophy, even one with the potential for really positive outcomes,
Right.
it can be distorted, it can be twisted to serve someone else's agenda.
So it's not like some get-out-of-jail-free card for bad behavior.
No, definitely not.
All
And
right.
Aperture really emphasizes that that's why it's so crucial to engage with these ideas critically, to look at them from every angle. It's about understanding the potential, but also being really honest about the pitfalls.
Which I think is what we're doing here, hopefully, trying to get past those surface-level takes
Totally.
and really dig into what makes this whole concept tick.
I like it.
Okay, so speaking of potential pitfalls, one that seems to come up a lot with nihilism is this whole falling into despair thing. Like, how do we acknowledge that void without letting it just completely swallow us whole?
That's a big question.
Because, I mean, it's one thing to say, okay, the universe doesn't have some preordained plan for me.
Right.
But it's another thing entirely to actually sit with the reality that it might just be this big, vast, indifferent thing.
Yeah.
And I'm just this tiny speck in it.
Yeah.
So how do we navigate that without just curling up into a ball?
Well, this is where I think Aperture offers a really intriguing perspective.
Okay.
They suggest that instead of being afraid of that void, what if we actually tried to find a sense of liberation within it?
Wait. Liberation in the nothingness.
I know, it sounds kind of paradoxical, right?
It kind of does.
But stick with me for a second. They're basically arguing that when we let go of all these traditional structures and beliefs that we've been clinging to,
Okay.
like the need for external validation or that pressure to constantly conform to what society says we should be doing,
Okay.
we create this amazing opening, this space for something really authentic and meaningful to emerge.
It's like we stop trying to find that meaning outside of ourselves and instead we turn inward.
Yes.
It's about tapping into that inner wellspring of like creativity and purpose that maybe was always there, but it was just buried under all that external noise.
100%. It's not so much about, oh, the universe doesn't care. It's more like the universe is this giant blank canvas.
Yeah.
And I get to decide what I want to create on it.
Oh, I really like that.
Right.
Because it reframes the whole thing. It's less about lack and more about possibility.
Yeah, exactly. It's about tapping into that sense of limitless possibility that often gets overshadowed by the fear and the despair.
Right, because when you actually stop and think about it, it's kind of an exciting thought. It doesn't have to be all doom and gloom.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what Aperture is pointing to, that sense of like incredible, unbounded possibility. They're arguing that nihilism, when it's fully embraced, it can actually be this catalyst for amazing things, creativity, innovation, personal growth. It's about recognizing that we're not just pawns in some predetermined game. We actually have the power to rewrite the rules entirely.
You know, that actually reminds me of something they mentioned earlier about how this concept of nihilism can be a driving force for positive social change.
It can.
But how does that work, though? I mean, wouldn't a world full of nihilists just be totally chaotic?
That's definitely a common misconception. But think about it this way. If you truly believe that all these existing power structures, all these systems that govern our lives, if you really believe they're inherently meaningless, aren't you going to be more likely to question them?
Yeah, I guess so.
To challenge the status quo.
Right.
And that can be a really potent catalyst for activism, for standing up against injustice, for building a world that's actually more equitable for everyone.
So it's not about becoming apathetic. It's about channeling that energy into actually dismantling those broken systems.
Exactly.
And building something better in their place.
Yes. And again, it's not about destroying things just for the sake of destruction. It's about critically examining the things that we've been told to value.
Right.
And then asking ourselves, do those things actually align with the kind of world we want to live in?
So it's not about being destructive. It's about being discerning.
Exactly. Which, circles us right back to the importance of defining those values, that moral compass for ourselves.
Right.
It's about asking, okay, what do I actually believe in? What kind of world do I want to see? And what am I willing to do to help bring that about?
I love that. So it's less about anything goes and more about what do I choose to create.
Yes. And that's the key, right?
It's empowering.
It is empowering. And that's what Aperture is really driving at. We're not just passive bystanders in our own lives or in the face of these larger systems.
Yeah.
We have agency. We have choices.
Mm.
And with those choices comes an incredible responsibility,
It's a lot to take in, right?
It is.
Like, it's liberating to realize, oh, I get to write my own story.
Right.
But then it's also like, wait, I have to actually pick up the pen and figure out what to write.
Yeah. But that's part of what makes it so amazing, right?
Yeah, it is.
And the thing is, Aperture is reminding us we don't have to have it all figured out right away. It's a process.
Right.
There's going to be exploration, questioning, probably some trial and error along the way.
Totally. Yeah.
It's about embracing the journey, even when it's messy or confusing.
It's like we might not have all the answers right away,
Right.
but it would be helpful to at least have some kind of map.
Sure.
Like, what are some concrete things that people can do to actually start incorporating these ideas into their lives? Where do we even begin?
That's the question.
Yeah.
And one of the most powerful things Aperture suggests is that we start paying really close attention to the stories we're telling ourselves.
Okay, wait. What do you mean by that? Like the stories we read in books or watch on TV?
Right.
Or something else?
It's more about those internal narratives we all carry around inside of us.
Okay.
Like our beliefs about who we are, what we're capable of, our place in the world, all that.
Oh, I see. So becoming aware of all those like subconscious thoughts, all
Yeah.
those deeply ingrained beliefs that really shape how we experience the world around us.
Exactly. And the thing is, we all have them. And they're often formed by our upbringing, our culture, even like traumatic experiences that we might not even be fully conscious of anymore.
Right.
So it's about asking ourselves, okay, are the stories I'm telling myself actually helping me to create the life that I want?
Yeah.
Or are they actually holding me back in some way?
Mm. And what happens if we realize those stories are holding us back? How do we rewrite them?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And honestly, that's where the real work begins. Reframing those old negative narratives
Okay.
and then starting to replace them with something new, something more empowering, more in line with who we are and who we want to be.
It's kind of like we've been handed this script for our lives, but it's totally the wrong one. And we finally get to just toss it out and start improvising our own scenes.
That's such a great way to put it,
Right.
because it really gets at the heart of what Aperture is trying to say,
Yeah.
that we have way more agency than we tend to give ourselves credit for.
Right.
It's not about pretending like life is all sunshine or rainbows,
Right.
or denying that like bad stuff happens.
Yeah.
It's more about realizing that we get to decide how we react to those experiences.
Mm.
We can either let those experiences make us bitter, or we can use them as fuel to grow.
So it's like we're not just products of whatever happened in the past.
Right.
We're also the architects of whatever we want our futures to be.
Exactly. And that's where the real power of nihilism kicks in.
All right.
It can help us break free from those limiting beliefs that are holding us back
Right.
and actually create something way more fulfilling and empowering for ourselves.
It's like we can finally step into the driver's seat of our lives and start heading in the direction we choose.
I love that because it's so true.
Right.
We're not just along for the ride. Like, we have a say in where we end up.
And I don't know about you, but that's both kind of terrifying,
Yeah.
but also incredibly exciting at the same time.
It is. It's a huge responsibility.
Right.
But it's also this amazing gift because what it means is we're not just pawns in some predetermined game,
Right.
We have the power to shape our own destinies.
And that actually brings us to another really key point that Aperture makes.
Okay.
It's about the importance of finding those little moments of beauty and meaning in the everyday stuff of life.
It's so easy to forget that.
I know it sounds kind of cliche,
Totally.
but I think there's something really profound about it,
Yeah.
especially when you're looking at it through this nihilistic lens.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's so easy to get caught up in always chasing after these huge accomplishments, these big, extraordinary experiences,
Yeah.
that we completely miss the simple things that actually make life worth living in the first place.
We're so busy like running toward the next big thing
Yeah.
that we totally forget to even appreciate the beauty of the moment we're in right now.
100%. And nihilism, like when you really lean into it,
Yeah.
it encourages us to slow down, to savor those everyday experiences
Mm.
and to find that sense of wonder in those little, seemingly insignificant moments.
It's like, We can find so much joy in that perfectly made cup of coffee.
Yes,
Or a walk in nature, a deep conversation with someone we love,
exactly.
All those little things that actually make up, like, the actual fabric of our lives.
Because when we can approach our lives with that sense of presence, of gratitude for those moments,
Right.
even the most ordinary everyday things can suddenly become extraordinary.
It's about finding that contentment, that joy right here, right now,
Yes.
instead of constantly chasing after some external thing that always seems out of reach.
And that shift in thinking, from like happiness is something I have to achieve
Right.
to happiness is something I can cultivate within myself.
Yeah,
It can be so incredibly liberating.
it is. Because it helps us to realize that true fulfillment,
Yeah.
it doesn't come from getting all the stuff. It comes from learning to appreciate the stuff we already have.
100%.
Yeah.
And that actually leads us to another really important aspect of nihilism that Aperture talks about.
Okay, what's that?
Its implications for how we approach our relationships with other people.
That's interesting because at first glance, nihilism almost seems like it would be this very individualistic kind of philosophy.
Yeah,
But it sounds like it actually has a lot to say about connection as well.
it totally does.
Mm.
Because even if the universe doesn't inherently care whether we have relationships or not,
Right.
that doesn't mean that those relationships don't matter.
Right. They can still be one of the most important things in our lives.
Exactly. In fact, you could argue that they matter even more.
Yeah.
Because if we let go of this idea that our relationships are somehow preordained,
Yeah.
like they're guaranteed to work out a certain way,
Right.
we might actually be more likely to appreciate them for the incredible but also fragile gifts that they are.
It's like choosing to love someone not because you're supposed to,
Right.
but because you recognize how precious and important that connection is to you.
Exactly. And when we approach it like that, it can lead to much deeper, more genuine, more fulfilling relationships overall.
It's about, like, showing up for the people in our lives
Yes.
and really appreciating them for who they are, loving them with everything we've got,
Yeah.
knowing that nothing is guaranteed, that everything, including our time with the people we love, is temporary.
That's deep, but it's true.
It is.
And when you really let that sink in, when you really embrace that impermanence,
Yeah.
it can actually help us to appreciate the present moment so much more
Mm.
and the people that we're sharing it with.
It's about recognizing that even love is a choice.
Hmm.
It's something we consciously decide to do every single day
Right.
to show up for the people who mean the most to us.
That's such a powerful way to look at it.
It is powerful, right?
Yeah.
And honestly, I think it's incredibly freeing, too.
Why? How so?
Because when we understand that, when we really get that deep down, it frees us from that fear of loss
Hmm.
and that pressure to hold on too tightly.
Right.
It lets us love more freely, more
Right.
openly and authentically.
And that kind of love, the kind that's
Mm.
not afraid to be vulnerable, the kind that's rooted in acceptance and appreciation for all of it, that's powerful stuff.
It really is.
It's the kind of stuff that can change the world, honestly.
I think so, too. And you know what? I think that's a perfect place for us to wrap things up.
I agree. That feels like a good place to land.
So, to bring it all home, it seems like nihilism, it's not this gloomy, depressing thing that everyone makes it out to be.
Not at all.
It can actually be this incredible catalyst for growth, for having deeper, more meaningful relationships, and for making the world a better place.
It's about acknowledging that void,
Yeah.
but then it's about making the conscious choice to step into that space
Yeah.
and fill it with things that reflect our values, our passions,
Right.
the things that make us feel alive.
So it's about recognizing that even in a universe that might feel indifferent to our existence, our lives still have meaning.
They do?
We still have purpose. We
Yeah.
can still make a difference.
We absolutely can.
Yeah,
And that's a pretty powerful message to carry with us.
it is. So as you go about your day to day, we want you to ask yourself,
Yeah.
what are you going to create?
I like it.
What kind of impact will you have?
Love it.
Because even in a universe that might seem like it doesn't care one way or the other, your life matters.
This does.
You have the power to make a difference, and the world is waiting to see what you do with it.